Okay, so I think we can start at this moment since we have all the speakers there, and yeah, dear speakers and dear audience, good afternoon, and welcome to this panel of the European Security and Defense Network Student Association here at the College of Europe. And today we're asking ourselves if CSDP is a tool to address the hybrid threats in the EU Eastern neighborhood. And it's a great pleasure, me as the president of the European Security and Defense Network, to see so many participants that have registered, and we're expecting them to connect sooner or later. And I believe we will have a very interesting discussion on the issues that currently shape the narrative of the future common security and defense policy, as well as what concerns EU's efforts to counter hybrid threats, both within and outside its borders. So I would like first to say some words about the European Security and Defense Network. As I said, it's a student society here at the college. It has been established 2 years ago, and our student society seeks to provide students with a keen interest in defense and security, a platform from where they can share experiences, gain knowledge, and build a professional network. So therefore, before we get started with the actual discussion, just a few housekeeping notes. The discussion will be organized in the following way. After the introduction, we will open the floor for a discussion on some key aspects of the current efforts of the EU to address hybrid threats in its neighborhood, and particularly in the Eastern neighborhood. And then we will talk about the current state of security deficit in EU's Eastern neighborhood and the feasible forms of cooperation with CSDP or within CSDP to address hybrid threats. And against this background, we will elaborate on two main means to address hybrid threats, and namely strategic communication and civilian CSDP missions. And after this, we'll have a Q&A session where questions from the audience will be raised. And at this point, I would like to ask the audience to write the questions in the chat function of WebEx, or also use the raise the hand function. Also, you can find it in the menu bar, so to speak, below. The discussion is scheduled for between 11 o'clock and 12 o'clock. And now I have the pleasure to introduce the speakers. So we have Dr. Nicu Popescu, who is the director of Wider Europe program at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and he is the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Republic of Moldova and has also published extensively on the EU relationship with Russia and Eastern Partnership countries, and is a strong advocate of strengthening the EU security cooperation with its Eastern partners. We also have Ms. Crista HUISMAN from the European External Action Service. She's the head of the Civilian Crisis Management sector and the pen holder of the Mini Concept and the Civilian CSDP Compact. And we also have the pleasure to have with us Mr. Lutz GÜLLNER, who is the head of Strategic Communication and Information Analysis Division, also at the European External Action Service. And in his work, Mr. GÜLLNER focuses on information manipulation and foreign interference and on disinformation threats for the EU and for the EU neighborhood region. So now I would like to start our discussion finally. And we know that since 2014, the EU has incrementally increased its efforts to tackle and address hybrid threats in its neighborhood, and several documents have been adopted. And also recently in January 2021, finally we can say that we have a structured approach to the concept of hybrid threats due to the analytical framework that has been issued by the European Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats. And just a brief definition of hybrid threats for the audience that is today with us, since it's such a difficult concept to grasp. So hybrid threats are defined, for instance, by the European Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats as coordinated and synchronized action that deliberately targets democratic states and institutions' systematic vulnerabilities through a wide range of means. and hybrid activities exploit the threshold of detection and attribution, are aimed at influencing different forms of decision-making and different levels, and are designed to further fulfill the agent's strategic goals while undermining or hurting the target. And I would like to start with Mr. Popescu with the first question and ask you, Mr. Popescu, why is it important for the EU to pay attention to the security gap, so to speak, that the Eastern neighbors or the Eastern partners are facing? Do you hear us? We don't hear you, Mr. Popescu. I think you are muted.
Do you? It's not public, right? It's not quotable. It's not
we would like to record
the
event and make it available to a wider audience, if that's okay with you. Sorry?
Yeah, it's okay.
I am currently recording, indeed.
Okay. So there's several things. If you look at the European neighborhood policy, but also even EU enlargement policy in the Balkans, you'd see that the EU is mostly focused on political and socio-economic change in these countries. The EU is very good at supporting and creating and launching, free trade areas with Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia. Deep and comprehensive means that these countries have to adopt the European legislation. You have the visa-free regime offered to most of the countries of the Western Balkans and the Eastern Partnership. You have visa facilitation. With some countries, you have support for energy efficiency, energy security, democratization, support for civil society. The list of European Union efforts is very long, and these efforts have had a very, very positive effect on the transformation of countries like Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, but again, also countries in the Balkans like Serbia or Bosnia. Without everything the EU does, the situation would have been much worse. These countries would have been poorer, less democratic, less stable, less secure. Nonetheless, the EU has been quite shy when it comes to security cooperation writ large. By that I mean also defense cooperation, also intelligence cooperation. And I don't mean just the EU institutions, because very often they don't have a mandate to do these things, but I also mean the EU member states and the EU agencies. And here is where we have a problem. And this problem is partly present in the Balkans and even more so in the Eastern Partnership. So I'll give you just an example of a country like Serbia. Serbia is a candidate country. It has a process of accession to the EU where they negotiate over 30 plus chapters: education, healthcare, civil society, media freedoms. But if you look at Serbia's main and most important defense partner, it's Russia. The links between the Serbian Defense Ministry and the Russian Defense Ministry are much deeper and more systematic than the links with most defense ministries of EU member states. Now, this type of problem is partly mitigated and is less visible for countries which are joining or have joined NATO, like Montenegro or Albania. There, the defense cooperation front is covered through NATO, and that works. But for a country like Serbia or Bosnia or Kosovo, you don't have the NATO track, which is so obvious. So we have a situation where the European Union is engaged in an enlargement process, but is only touching upon the socio-economic and political aspects of transforming and reforming some candidate countries. So if I try to project the situation from here into 10 or 20 years, what are we getting into the European Union? A country that potentially would have European healthcare standards but would not necessarily have the closest defense partnerships with EU member states, right? So there we have a problem. Especially if we all say in the European Union that we want to build a geopolitical Europe, a Europe puissance, a Europe that speaks the language of power, or a Europe that is strategically autonomous. So here is the question is, why billions of euro in European assistance go into capacity building, to healthcare, to phytosanitary agencies, to export promotion, to the environment, which is all very good and completely indispensable. But this is not matched on the security and defense front. So I think we have a problem there. The same goes with the Eastern Partnership, where the security sector is a major sector which is insufficiently transformed. Let's put it softly. So you have a situation where Europe, on the one hand, says that the EU wants to be geopolitical. On the other hand, is very shy about developing security cooperation with countries like Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, on a lot of sensitive domains. Why? Well, because it's sensitive, because the member states are some member states are sometimes reluctant, because the EU does not have prerogatives to do a lot of things in this area. There are multiple reasons and they accumulate. But of course, the kind of more and bigger fundamental question is that if the EU does not do it, who does it? And there's always willing partners and countries who would do that. And here, I would, of course, I'm always quite impressed by how deep and fast developing is, for example, the Turkish-Ukrainian partnership in security and defense matters. It's drones, it's aircraft engines, there's a lot of stuff happening between Ukraine and Turkey. Of course, Turkey and Azerbaijan have a very deep defense partnership, but even a country like Israel has a very good and deep and profound security partnership with a country like Azerbaijan. So, of course, Russia has very strong security relations and defense relations and partnerships with Belarus, with Armenia, with Serbia. So, and the United States are as well quite open to security cooperation. So, by looking at all of that, I see a big disconnect between Europe, the EU, which says that they want to be a geopolitical power and a powerful player, and at the same time avoids engaging and supporting and doing capacity building and deeper engagement on a major scale with some of the Eastern partners where this is possible. I don't think this is very kind of easy to do or possible with Belarus today, but with Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, it is possible. There's a demand for that. Now, another question is, how do you consolidate democracy without having a strong and reformed security and defense sector? You cannot consolidate. I mean, in order to have a functional democracy, you need strong civil society, strong independent media, functional institutions, but you also need a security sector that is democratic. There is no democracy which has strong civil society and a corrupt, rotten, disintegrated, co-opted, and penetrated intelligence service, for example. You need both. You need a strong civil society and independent media and intelligence services and the army. So if the EU is to achieve democratic consolidation in the Eastern Partnership, it needs to do more on this front of security cooperation with the states. Otherwise, you cannot achieve European Union's goals just through free trade areas. And here we have a problem. The member states, some member states are interested, some are less interested. The problem is that the interested member states have few resources to inject into these goals. The member states which are less interested, sometimes they have higher resources, they are bigger member states, but they are not very interested, or they don't have a tradition of doing security and defense cooperation. And at the same time, there is not enough support offered to the EU institutions. Now, one more minute. The EU has been trying to solve solve this conundrum by going down this resilience front. And resilience is great, but is also very, very minimalistic. So if you go to the EU global strategy, the word resilience is mentioned almost 40 times. It's probably around 35, 36, if you count with summary and sub-chapters. The single most frequently used. But what is resilience? Resilience is when someone hits you and you're recovering. Or something explodes, like in Beirut, and then you try to sort out the mess. Resilience is a very minimalistic goal. It assumes that the system has collapsed and you need to recover. Resilience is about recovery, not capacity to resist, not capacity to avoid the collapse. So the EU has been trying to do something on the resilience front. That's much better than not doing anything on this front. But we should also be very aware that conceptually that is a relatively limited goal. So my belief is that it's very important for the European Union to sit down with the member states and channel some of the financial resources that are allocated to the Eastern Partnership countries into security and defense cooperation with the neighbors, in cooperation and coordination and in support of member states' capabilities and prerogatives to do that. And another kind of concrete idea is that if you go and check the legal mandates of many EU agencies, ENISA, the European Network Information and Information Security Agency from Crete and Athens, they don't have a mandate. They don't have as part of their legal mandate the right to engage systematically with third states. In the European Defence Agency, their legal powers to engage in cooperation with third countries is also very limited. So, even there's stuff to be done in revising the mandates of EU agencies and make them more open to security cooperation with third countries. And everyone is doing that. Russia is doing that, the US is doing that, Turkey is doing that, Israel is doing that. EU member states are doing that, but we need more on this front. And CSDP, 20 seconds, is a tiny, tiny bit of what I mean. CSDP, I mean, from the fact that Ukraine will send 20 civilian officers into a EU civilian mission and Georgia will send 100 soldiers into an EU military operation. That's great, but that's a very, very tiny part of what needs to be done if the EU is to be a powerful player on the global stage, is to be an influential security actor in its EU neighborhood, and if the EU is to see a much deeper transformation of the states. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Popescu. You have been opened lots of questions and introduced us to a lot of aspects of our issue indeed. And I'm sure that when it comes to CSDP, Ms. HUISMAN will have definitely something more to add with regard to the civilian part of the CSDP and how there, in fact, many of the current initiatives could be transformed or strengthen EU external action when it comes to countering hybrid threats. But I would like now to turn to Mr. GÜLLNER and ask you, Mr. GÜLLNER, how do you see strategic communication countering hybrid threats? Or what is the role of strategic communication in countering hybrid threats in the Eastern Partnership countries, or at least the association countries? To start there first.
Well, there are many related questions, and there would be many things to comment on what Mr. Popescu has said, including his expression of whatever, frustration or whatever we would call it. You can also look at it from the other side, and I'm sure that Crista will speak about this in terms of what has been built up already over the past few years is pretty amazing. Not everything is perfect, and it depends, of course, also how much, how far we as European Union can go I don't need to explain to anybody here on this panel or to the audience, that there are different expectations and different kind of perspectives in the member states on this, and related to other security providers, of course, in particular NATO. Let me start by answering your question, first of all, coming back to your definition and characterization of hybrid issues. I think there is hardly any other word than hybrid and disinformation, where everybody interprets their own views, their own ideas, etc. And we are sometimes a little bit lost with these terms. And it's very, very important to have a clear idea what we are talking about. Otherwise, you cannot develop a policy how to deal with it on either active or reactive side. So I don't want to redefine hybrid. It's also a much broader issue. But maybe let me talk a little bit about what is a new or relatively new, because it's now for 5-6 years pretty high on the agenda, challenge that we are seeing in this kind of quickly developing technological world that we're living in. And that is something that a lot of people describe as disinformation. I would describe it as information manipulation and interference, because it comes in very different forms and shapes. It is not about the competition of narratives. It can be part of this, but it cannot be reduced to this. So it's not what says the one and what says the other. It is much more about the ability or the intention to go into the information space, into the information environment of the opponent or of a target country, and starting to manipulate it in a way that gives whatever advantages or that has a strategic objective there. And that is something which we all heard, which we all see somehow, but it is a moving target as well. This became pretty clear in 2014, 15, I think, first of all, with activities by pro-Kremlin actors. It's not always a country as a whole, so it's not Russia, but it's the security apparatus and it's the ecosystem around it. Around the Ukraine conflict and, of course, the annexation of Crimea. And then we could see this kind of technique further building, not only for those specific issues, but also in interference in elections. We could see it a year in 2016 in the US elections. We could see it a year later in the French elections. And we see a quickly developing new technique, a new issue in international relations. And here comes my point, and that's why it fits very well for our discussion. I think an important security and foreign policy, so CFSP and CSDP issue, that we need to deal with. Disinformation, I come to strategic communications, don't worry, but just to frame it a little bit, disinformation is therefore cannot be reduced to the external threat, but it's also the external threat. And that is what it makes so difficult. So it's a societal issue, where you need to work on media literacy, where you need to work on, how a population, how a nation, how a society deals actually with this information society, where people work in filter bubbles, where the consumption of media has changed. That is the societal part. Very important, needs to be addressed, and it's a huge issue. But the point that we are talking about here is the part of a deliberate interference, of a deliberate and intentional manipulation effect, not to make kind of the image better. So it's not a kind of public diplomacy plus program, but it can be a real destabilization activity to sow discord, confusion, and it can interfere even in democratic rights in terms of suppression of voices, with bots and intimidation campaigns. And that is where strategic communications come in. That's the third term that is not very sharply defined, to be honest, because strategic communications is not the communications, it's not just going out there and filling the space. It is more. It is really thinking about where are the vulnerabilities of the societies? Where are the elements, I mean, both on the defensive side, so vulnerabilities, strengthening resilience, identifying the gaps that need to be filled, but also on the offensive side in the sense of, okay, the moment, that we have an issue out there, and if you create a vacuum, this will be very eagerly filled, by these new mechanisms that are used by other players. So for me, it is again, it's not so much strategic communications in the narrow sense of the word, of being out there, of having your voice heard, of having a very targeted approach as well for audiences, but it's more strategic communications as an overall element in our security concept. It is about understanding the situational or the information environment, so situational awareness. The second element for me is resilience. So how can I strengthen my own, and there I would slightly disagree with Mr. Popescu. It's not only a reactive post kind of activity fixing the mess issue. It is actually, if it's done well and correctly, it is a preventive, it's an anticipatory kind of strategy, but of course very difficult to deploy. Third one or third element in this, let's say, strategic communications element is the disruption. So we also need to push back. We also need to stop these activities. And the fourth one would then be the deployment of very, very specific actions. And this is a bit kind of in the making. So all in all, for me, kind of, we need to do even more in the neighborhood in this area. We need to understand that it's a security issue. We need to understand that this is an issue that goes beyond kind of how these societies look like and how they interact, but also how they can defend their own democracy, how they can defend their own structures, because this is important. And why is it also a security issue? Because very often it is linked to issues related in hybrid, famous hack and leak operations, to many other hybrid activities that we see, from interference activities, from corruption, from building up proxy systems, etc., that we see more and more, and the list is long of these different elements. So, in short, for me, absolutely necessary to further invest in this area, to link it closely to foreign and security policy. In the end, and that's my last sentence in this introductory round, it is also an issue of the EU's ability in the end to implement its own policies, And if we have a fantastic neighborhood policy, which I think is strong, well defined, etc., there I, however, have a lot of sympathies with Mr. Popescu. We need to anchor this policy closer also in not only in our thematic policies, but also in the overall security concept that we have. But I'm sure Crista will say much more about this. Thank you.
Indeed, Ms. Huisman, it was intentionally, so to speak, that I left you to be the last one to take the word, because I saw all this as a build up to what in fact your work is related to. And yeah, as we can see already from the panel, we have touched upon many aspects of EU's efforts to tackle hybrid threats, from resilience, which is a pretty broad concept, resilience building and development, to situational awareness and many other issues that have to be addressed within the CFSP and CSDP. And that's why I would like to give you the floor now. And we have talked about many initiatives, many thoughts, ideas that could be implemented, that could consolidate the cooperation between the EU and its neighborhood, or namely Eastern neighbors, in order to tackle hybrid threats. But in my opinion, I see the civilian CSDP missions, if we want to narrow down even more, as a way, as a start to tackling hybrid threats. We know that We have 2 civilian missions in the Eastern Partnership country, one in Georgia, UMM, the monitoring mission, and then in Ukraine, the advisory mission. And I would say for now, the advisory mission in Ukraine has the most of the tools, and the mandate allows it as well to address hybrid threats. But what I found interesting as well is to see that your work, namely strengthening the civilian, the document on strengthening the civilian CSDP compact, and even more specific, the mini concept on civilian CSDP, writes that the mandate has to be considered that the mandate of the missions broaden further or beyond the security sector reform in order to even include an operational line on tackling hybrid threats. And I wonder what exactly is meant by that. Where is the direction that the EU takes, so to speak, in the field of civilian crisis management?
Yeah, thanks a lot. There's a lot of topics raised, and yeah, I'm tempted to respond to a lot of things. But indeed, as already mentioned before, also by Mr. POPESCU, I believe talking about the exact mandates and tasks is very difficult in an open line. Huh? So let me say some words in general about our CSDP missions, Common Security and Defense Policy. But let me start first to say a few words about the context and how that's changing. So we see that around the I think Mr. GÜLLNER called it the security belt, but we see an increasing amount of armed conflict, civil wars, and instability in the EU's broader neighborhood. We see also an increase in transnational threats, such as hybrids, of course, with a direct impact on the EU's internal security. And of course, we see a huge jump in new technologies, connectivity, and an increasing dependency on the different networks. Now, the EU global strategy marked a turning point in our security and defense policy because it had it actually defined 3 strategic priorities: responding to external conflicts and crises, supporting capacity building of our partners, and also protecting the EU and its citizens. So it combined the internal and the external security nexus. A key instrument in responding to the external conflict and crisis are our civilian and military missions and operations. Currently, we have 17, 6 military missions and operations, out of which 3 training missions and 3 executive operations, and 11 civilian missions with around 3,000 people currently deployed. So indeed, as Mr. POPESCU mentioned, it is a small tool, but it is one of the key tools because we have people on the ground. So all these missions and operations are based on a principle of local ownership. And you mentioned 2 of them. We have currently missions in Ukraine, Georgia, Kosovo, 2 in the Palestinian territories, Iraq, Somalia, Central African Republic, Mali, Niger, and Libya. And all these missions face, to a different extent, hybrid threats, but I wouldn't limit it only to the Eastern partners. Also, the missions in Africa face hybrid threats, or the EU. Our missions and operations have mandates that are tailored to cover a broad range of tasks. This includes supporting security sector reform or providing training to the local law enforcement, but also to help address challenges related to organized crime, terrorism, cybersecurity, or, as discussed today, hybrid threats. Now, of course, countering hybrid threats is one of the most complex challenges because it involves so many different elements. And as they are also changing, what we try to do is to mainstream awareness on this throughout our missions, and to support the host states based on a whole of government and a whole of society approach. Now, in the area of CSDP, specifically civilian CSDP, possible hybrid actions conducted by a third party generally aim at discrediting and hampering the action of the EU and its member states. It's not always targeted towards individual missions. It's often targeted towards the EU as a whole. But as these missions are on the ground, they of course face it and notice it in their actions. So I mentioned disinformation campaigns, but also cyber attacks or reporting very negatively about efforts done, training or whatever done by the EU on the ground. I must also say that hybrid threats against missions directly are not the norm. As I mentioned, disinformation campaigns target often the EU as such and try to delegitimize the EU in general. So it's very diverse, and there's a big difference between the different countries and between the different theaters. Now, in both cases, the mission responds to such threats through information campaigns, through strategic information in general, for instance, through the presentation of the mission's mandate or the mission's results. And we never apply the same strategies. So we do positive communication, and we don't generate disinformation on any entities. So taking this reality, civilian CSDP missions started to develop concrete activities in this field, Some missions deal with it directly, while others deal with it indirectly. I mentioned already disinformation, security sector reform, but also analysis of related hybrid threats. And cybersecurity, of course. Our missions work closely together with other partners. This is also an aim to further strengthen it, but we do work very closely with other partners and entities that work on specific hybrid challenges. Now, as you mentioned, the compact and the mini concept, we are working specifically on doing more in this field, but I'll leave that for the second part of this panel. So I'll leave it for here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ms. HUISMAN. I would like to return quickly to Mr. Popescu, and ask you, what do you see exactly as feasible forms for future cooperation between the Eastern Partnership countries and in the frame of the CSDP? How exactly do you see that? You've focused mainly in your intervention, so to speak, on aspects of defense, and I would like to focus a bit more on that. So how do you see which forms of cooperation or which platforms of cooperation do you see happening between the Eastern Partnership and countries and the EU in the framework of the CSDP?
Well, you can do a lot of thousand small things, and I'll throw in just maybe a couple of them. As we all know, the EU as an institution is not very adapted to engaging in high politics, security and defense cooperation. That's the nature of things. So I think there's several ways that one can explore a deepening of this cooperation. One is try and make the mandates of the EU agencies more open to such interaction. So now the conversation about the cybersecurity center that will be opened in Bucharest, for example, already includes a much greater legal mandate to engage in cooperation with third countries than the existing mandate of ENISA, right? So at some point, step number one is almost to do an audit of the legal mandates of institutions and see where do we need to tweak these mandates potentially to. The second step is to try and allocate more resources to that kind of those kind of activities. So again, theoretically, and I will never beat a knowledgeable EU official on how to get the procedure right. But my hope is that at least, even if it's 5 or 10% of the funding allocated to the European Neighbourhood Policy or the Eastern Partnership, but the same applies to enlargement and relations with MENA. If the EU could allocate a higher amount of financial resources to security cooperation, that would be good. As I said, I think it's very important to support the modernization and capacity building of phytosanitary agencies in these countries, but it's also good if some funds can also go into capacity building for the security sector. Now, what do you do with these funds? Again, there can be projects implemented in support or together with the member states. There can be projects implemented together with NATO. There can be projects implemented together with Britain, with Canada, with the US, or implemented independently by the EU institutions. I mean, there's lots of things that can be done on that front. Probably the lower hanging fruit is cybersecurity cooperation. The EU has more powers to help partners build up cybersecurity, and here I mostly refer to hard cybersecurity things like the security of governmental institutions, military, ministries, but also critical infrastructure, railways, electricity, electricity distribution networks, gas pipelines, all of that. There is a lot of stuff that can be done. You know, maybe at some point it would be useful to look whether the EU CERTs, the computer emergency response teams, can also cooperate or even be deployed in support of third partners if we create the legal basis for that. So I think there's quite a lot the EU can do, for example, in capacity building for third countries when they build up their cyber capabilities, be it institutions like the CERTs, or be it just investing in a better cybersecurity for critical infrastructure. And you can do these things with money, and the EU is has more funds than powers to cooperate on defense. So some of these things can also be done with funds, and not necessarily with a lot of complicated conversations regarding defense and intelligence cooperation, for example. So I'd start exploring in that direction, both in the Western Balkans and in selected Eastern Partnership countries, but also in selected countries in the Middle East, where, again, the EU has close partners. Now, what you do, I mean, there's two ways of measuring, or there's many ways of measuring what the EU does. One way is to measure it compared to what the EU has been doing 5 or 10 years ago. And definitely there is progress. The EU does much more than on this front than it was doing 5 or 10 years ago. The European institutions want to do that, they have the resources, but it's sometimes complicated with getting the political support behind that. But of course, the value of being looking at this from outside the institutions is that another way of measuring what the EU does is also by comparing it to what other partners are doing, or sometimes to what the EU ambitions were doing. I'm someone who grew up with intellectually, I was a student, so I started kind of reading daily about the EU around 99, 2000, and at the time we had this big thing called the Helsinki headline goals. It's the EU's capacity to deploy 60,000 soldiers within, I don't remember what, maybe 60 days, and we are not yet there. So so when I measure EU ambitions, yes, I acknowledge there is progress, but what my generation wanted from the EU 20 years ago. While the EU was working towards the Helsinki headline goals, we haven't achieved that. And we're like more than 10 years. I think we're like 12 or 14 years beyond the deadline of the supposed would-be implementation of the Helsinki headline goals. So again, I mean, the EU, unfortunately, I find is less ambitious about what it wants to do in security and defense than it was in 1999 when the Helsinki headline goals were adopted. So I also measure EU performance today, not just to some, crazy benchmarks like, let's do more than China, Russia, or the United States, but even compared to what the EU was saying what they want to be doing 20 years ago, I find the level of foreign policy ambition has not necessarily grown. That's, to me, very unfortunate. And as I said, that's not something which should be held against the current EU institutions. They are doing a lot more than they did 5 years ago. But I do think there's a general problem with the pan-European level of ambition when it comes to security and defense matters. And that problem lies to a large extent with many member states, to procedures. There's lots of reasons behind that. And even looking ahead, I do fear that with the post-COVID recovery needs, again, the need for Europe to sustain minimally decent defense spending levels will again be under threat. And if you look around the neighborhood, you have wars, in Libya, Syria, Ukraine, South Caucasus. You have third powers getting security and defense footholds in EU candidate countries. The level of threats the EU faces in the neighborhood is much greater than 20 years ago. But the level of ambition, I cannot say is greater than it was 20 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Popescu. Mr. GÜLLNER, would you have something to add? And apart from that, there is also a question from the audience that I would like to ask you, since we're very quickly running out of time, and I would also like to offer the panel, the audience, the opportunity to address your questions. So please, if you have something to add, referring to what has been mentioned either by Mr. Popescu or Ms. HUISMAN, and also the question from one of the persons who attend our discussion is namely Dravesky Lukasz. He would like to ask you, how would you describe EU's external strategic communication in third countries or its systemic competitors, be it Russia or China?
Thank you. I keep it short because it goes fast, huh? An hour if you discuss a complex and interesting subject. So I think Crista answered a little bit the question how we need to combine things a little bit more. CSDP missions need to be better equipped, better aware also of these disinformation, information manipulation, and hybrid elements. Sometimes they are targeted directly, sometimes indirectly, exactly as Crista said. These are very important points. It's always easy to do this analysis. It's much more difficult to deal with this because what are the capabilities that you need to build, especially with limited resources, as we all know. So that's maybe the first point. The second point is we are working in the EU, and you have certainly read or heard about this, on a bit of new, not new, but reinvigorated approach, which is called the strategic compass. This will come out fairly soon. It is meant to do exactly what Mr. Popescu has said. So how can we bring these different elements together? How can we rethink kind of this strategy, which of course after 5 years is outdated because we have new threats, new developments, and that need to be brought in. And I hope it's not a spoiler alert, but especially the aspects of new threats, of developing threats, of resilience, but not only resilience as I said, as cleaning up the mess afterwards, but as anticipatory kind of investment is very, very prominent there. And maybe also coming back to something that Crista said, it's the link between the internal and the external security, which I think becomes more and more important on information manipulation, but on hybrid issues, but also on clear-cut kind of, let's say, security issues, the way they present themselves in any case. Last element to answer the question from Lucas. Well, it's a difficult thing to answer in general, because it really depends the country. And let me put it like this: many of our competitors in this field use asymmetric strategies, which means they invest in areas where we as European Union do not want to invest, in terms of interference, in terms of whatever manipulation campaigns, etc. That's something we don't want to engage, because we don't think that fighting fire with fire is really helping. So that always looks as if we're quite weak, as if we don't do the right thing, as if we don't hit back. On the other hand, if we, and I come back a third time to the term resilience, because I think resilience is more than this defensive holder. It's strengthening this capability to not even let it happen. And there, maybe the element from Mr. Popescu, this idea of also strengthening cybersecurity as an international issue, as a societal, as a security cooperation issue, is I think an avenue that is really important. I'm not speaking here now as an EU official, but I think ENISA does a fantastic job. I think we should think how we can cooperate a little bit better with other partners. But as I said, this is maybe music for the future. So difficult to answer, but maybe last element. I think we do. If you look at a specific country like Georgia, let me take that example. I think there you see a pretty good way how this kind of strategic communications, resilience, etc., is being rolled out in partnership, very often with NATO, by the way, in partnership with a government concerned, with the civil society. I think that is relatively successful, despite this society and this country being very, very targeted. It becomes much more problematic if we look at the Western Balkans, for example, where some governments are maybe not so interested even, or where it's more complicated even to work with some of the governments themselves. So sorry that I'm a little bit evasive now, but it really depends kind of on the place and the situation. I think I'll stop here, otherwise I talk too much and Crista still wants to add many things.
Yes, Ms. HUISMAN. I would like to offer you now the floor to complete with where you left it on the previous intervention, and also address you another question from the audience, and namely how and by which means and by which narratives, in fact, can the EU external missions be delegitimized, or their actions can be delegitimized by other actors.
Okay, I'm writing down this question. Okay.
I could repeat later if you want.
No, it's okay. So thank you very much, and I'll try to keep it super short. But I think the most interesting thing is actually what do we plan to do more, which is indeed something which was called by in the civilian CSDP compact by EU member states. They asked civilian CSDP missions to do more in a range of different areas. One of them is hybrid threats. So we have developed what we call a mini concept on hybrid threats, and the aim of this mini concept is exactly to explore what civilian missions could do more in this area, how this links with other actors, and also, as was mentioned previously, which capabilities would be needed to actually realize this, because we all know that especially on these complex fields, we don't have many people standing ready to go to CSDP missions. So this mini concept focuses on two aspects: the mission's own resilience and the mission's possible support to host state authorities. As far as the mission's own resilience, we argue, first of all, that there should be an increased general awareness among all mission staff. So it should be mainstreamed, as I mentioned earlier. But also, we call for dedicated staff in these missions that have the background and the knowledge to identify and analyze hybrid threats and support the EU, the mission, or the host state with this knowledge. The strengthening of the host state's resilience can be achieved through various means. Strategic communication was mentioned, but also we are looking into including specific lines of operations in the tasks of missions to place specific focus on these elements. There are also, in several countries where we have CSDP missions, hybrid risk survey exercises. The mini concept argues that CSDP missions could provide support to a host state with actually implementing these elements, as well as supporting them with the development of national strategies or legislations. Now, obviously, the mini concept is just the first step, because they are, the name says it all. They are menus. We propose to member states what they could think of. As was mentioned earlier, EU foreign policy is based on unanimous decision making, and that probably also explains the level of ambition that Mr. Popescu mentioned earlier. We need all 27 to agree on what are the tasks of these missions. Now, a few words on the capabilities needed, what we're looking at. So we have under the compact also a big, so the compact is basically the follow-up of the headline goal process, but it doesn't only focus on capability development, it focuses on the overall policy tool, so on all different levels. But capability development is a key part of it. So what are we looking at? We're looking at analytical capabilities, IT, strategic communication, but also elements such as cybersecurity or security sector reform, which is of course a key part also of building resilience. Now, to answer the question, I would really quickly through it, so sorry for only mentioning it very, very shallowly. By which means CSDP missions can be delegitimized. I would say it's mostly this information, negative reporting about the EU efforts, about the missions efforts. We've seen it in many of the theaters where CSDP missions are. We see different media, but also actors such as religious actors reporting very negatively or just plain wrong information. So we see it in many different fields, but my colleague Mr. GÜLLNER will know a lot more about the exact details on what information there is actually spread. But I would say that's the most part: disinformation, cyber attacks, etc., etc. Thanks. It was in 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. I was sure. I was anticipating that, and now I see it's indeed. There is so much to discuss, and there are so many initiatives and so much still to be figured out. But I'm very happy that we had this discussion. I think it's very timely, also in terms of the whole effort of strengthening the civilian CSDP, EU's efforts to tackle hybrid threats, but also of what's happening these days, the NATO summit. We didn't really talk much about cooperation with NATO, but I'm really happy that we went so much into detail and had such a thorough discussion on on what can be done, in fact, in the framework of the CSDP. I know I on purpose narrowed it down to the CSDP, cooperation with the Eastern Partnership in the framework of the CSDP, since yes, as I think all of us will agree, we can see after this discussion that there is a lot that can be done, a lot that should be reflected upon, and yeah, a lot of work ahead. So it's up to us now to reflect upon that and keep working hard in order to keep both the EU and its partners secure. I cannot thank you more for taking your time to be here with us and join this event, the last one for this year of the European Security and Defense Network. And thank you once again for taking your time and be with us and sharing with us your knowledge. It was a pleasure. Bye-bye.